The question of whether the US and Britain should extend Ukraine's permission to fire missiles within Russian borders is complex, high stakes, and requires nuance. That means one would hope those in a room discussing this are bringing a dose of realism to those discussions taking place in Washington right now. Unfortunately, one Labour minister is giving precisely the opposite impression.
These are two very significant powers. When America and the UK work together, then we can be a positive force in the world. And I think you'll see with Keir Starmer, Prime Minister, and with President Biden, you see a president who want to add up to a relationship that can be a positive force in the world.
That was Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, Peter Kyle, speaking to Sky. He won't actually be in that room in Washington, but presumably he's putting forward the position of the Labour government. I'm now joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, when America and the UK get together, do they tend to be a positive force in the world?
Well, when was the last time that Britain and the United States were a force for good in the world? I mean, you probably have to go back to 1945, don't you? And the defeat of the Wehrmacht and Adolf Hitler in continental Europe. And of course, you would include in that Joseph Stalin too. I don't imagine Peter Kyle will be singing the praises of Uncle Joe anytime soon. In terms of international affairs since 1945, this is the dynamic, dirty duo of international affairs. I think it's pretty fair to say that if the US and the UK come calling to your country, you're in deep proverbial. That was the case for the Iranians in 1953 with the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh. Of course, more recently, it was the case for Iraqis in 2003. But time after time, these two countries have used the cloak, the veneer of the global interests, of democracy, of liberties, for what were naked national interests on their behalf. But actually, more accurately put, it was the narrow interests of the United States, with Britain really the fifth wheel of the car, which is US foreign policy. And Labour love this story because it makes them feel important. And there's an inverse correlation between Britain's actual importance and our real power in the world, because of course everybody sensible knows that economic, technological, political, social, cultural power is shifting towards Asia. Anybody with a brain and a pair of eyes and ears knows that. But as Britain's comparative influence in the world falls, then it becomes even more appealing and alluring to our political class to cling to Washington's coattails because they want to feel important. 100 years ago, Britain was the world's largest empire in the mid-1920s. About a quarter of the planet's surface was the British Empire. So it's in the muscle memory, it's in the genetic memory of the British political class to think of themselves as global big shots. But in reality, we're a medium power in the northwest of Europe. We are, a nuclear power, of course, from the UN Security Council, of course. But the idea that somehow, the UK as a global power on a par with China or the United States is clearly absurd. So this is A, nonsense history, but B, and I think this is more important, this is the comforting, reassuring nonsense that our political class tell themselves to make themselves feel important.
In his, I don't think Peter Kyle has a particularly nuanced view of foreign policy. He's very much a sort of Blairite through and through. But if you were sort of to be very specific in what he said they can be a positive force in the world. Not they always are. So presumably, can we not pick out anything since 1945 where the two countries working together might have been a positive force in the world? I'm not an expert on the history of the Balkan War, but I know sort of people say the Kosovo intervention, if you're going to pick a liberal intervention that wasn't a disaster, you could go for that. Sierra Leone, I don't know, were the Americans involved there? I know the Brits were. Is it fair to say it's always a disaster when the UK and the US come knocking on your door? Are there not sort of some positives we can pick out?
Well, I don't want to go into Kosovo and the arguments for and against there, because of course one could argue that the recognition of Kosovo as a sovereign state has created a bunch of problems down the line with the Russians. That's not necessarily my view, but it's a view and it's a coherent view. Look, if you're talking about the UK and the US together, going through the apparatus of NATO, then maybe you may be able to talk about Kosovo. But even then, I don't think I would necessarily agree. But if we're talking about it's not unilateral because there's two of them, of course. But if we're talking about action taken exclusively by these two countries, and even then, if you talk about NATO, I mean, my God, Michael, Libya, Afghanistan. So you might use Kosovo as an edge case, I suppose. But even then, I don't think it's as clear cut as people make out. There was an argument to stop Milosevic and the Serbs, but then, of course, there was also bombing of Belgrade against civilian targets. We can have that argument, but it wasn't as sort of smiley faced and as purely wondrous as we're often led to believe. So look, I think generally speaking in international affairs, when the US and UK get involved in something, generally speaking, almost always, it's not really about democracy and liberties. It's something very different. And look, and the UK, as I've already said, Michael, is really an appendage here. If you're looking at Europe, you can make a positive case for US empire, right? Now, I'm not making a case for US empire. I don't believe in imperialism, but you could make that case because you can say that actually we have US empire in the 21st century, and look, Eastern Europe has developed incredibly well. If you look at just the brute numbers, nominal GDP, etc., since the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's done very well. But then let's do an accounting of the whole planet, Michael. And frankly, when the US and UK get together, Southeast Asia does very badly. Just ask people in Malaysia. Just ask people in Vietnam. Of course, the Brits weren't involved there, but these two powers in combination, I mean. Or go to West Asia. Go to the Middle East. And see what Palestinians think of the Brits and the Americans over the last century. Or see what Iranians think. Or see what Iraqis think. So, the experience and the apologism for US empire for people in Europe. So a Pole or a Slovak might say, I think it's great, you leftist idiots. They can make that argument. But actually, when you look at the world and the round, if you look at, like I say, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, West Asia, very, very different story.
Would the Japanese disagree? I suppose because the Middle East is clearly the area where you look and you say they've been a complete disaster. Is it the case that sort of in East and Southeast Asia, it's a bit more mixed? Some countries think that the US and the UK are a disaster. Some countries think that maybe they have been, a force for prosperity and security.
Well, technically, Japan is Northeast Asia. So Southeast Asia, I mean, well, the Indonesians would now say that, of course they would, but there was a mass murder of the Indonesian Communist Party, trade unionists, democratic activists. 1 million people were killed. 1 million plus people were killed in the 1960s. You've, of course, got Laos. You've got Vietnam. You've got story after story of absolute horror. And by the way, the amount of munitions dropped on the people of Vietnam and Laos by the US Air Force in the 1960s, 1970s is extraordinary. It blows out of the water the Dresden bombings in terms of the sheer power of the munitions being dropped. So, look, and again, it's not to say that the Americans are, evil and these other guys are really, the Russians are goodies. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is you might make an assessment of US empire looking at Europe and come to very different conclusions if you look at, say, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, or like I say, Southeast Asia.